Welcome everyone to the session on Shashi's newest book, An Era of Darkness.
Which embarrassingly I haven't brought to to show everybody, but it is around and available.
I think, it was released in November. Yeah. Shashi and I go back a long way. We were in high school together in St. Xavier's, not very far from here. He was actually a year senior to me. And in those days, as editor, he used to monopolize the pages of our students' paper, Nihil Ultra, Nothing Beyond. And we had to struggle to get an article or two in for publication. Now, of course, it's a pleasure to serve on the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, of which he is the chair. I should tell you that I read the book in manuscript, and it is a book which carries a lot of punch. And that's why I did not want Shashi to dilute the combative quality of his book by adding too much of academic nuance. And so that gives me an opening to perhaps question him a little bit about the sweeping judgments he has made on our British colonial masters. The book, which I hope you have read or will read soon, is organized according to themes. They are thematic chapters. And so he has to cover a long chronology. Bengal was under colonial rule for close to 200 years, Punjab for close to 100. And I wanted to start by putting forth a proposition to you, Shashi, that, you denounce British rule in its early phase, in the late 18th century, and you also catalogue the terrible things that were done in the very late colonial period. I would like to propose to you that, in fact, Crown Raj was worse than Company Raj, that the late Victorian era was worse than the early Victorian era. And I never thought that I'd have to defend the British Raj, but in the interest of a more sort of vibrant conversation, don't you think that in the late 18th century, the British did not really have sense of racial superiority? That was not really a period of nationalistic imperialism. There was a William Jones here in Calcutta who was very different from a James Mill of the early 19th century. The sins of a Clive and a Warren Hastings were not as awful as the sins of a Curzon or a Churchill in the early 20th. How would you want to provide a more careful periodization of this long era of darkness that you write about in your book?
Thank you, Sugata. And before I answer that wonderfully provocative question, let me say what a pleasure it is here to be here in Calcutta and to be here with Sugata Bose. Yes, he was in school with me at St. Xavier's, and he was a year behind me, which is probably why he missed the reunion of my batch that gathered in Calcutta this afternoon. And the Xaverian scarf I am wearing is what he missed out on as a result. But I have very deep and strong affection for the school and for the city, and it's wonderful to be back. Secondly, Sugata was being very modest. He was extremely helpful and kind in reading the manuscript, giving me some very useful feedback and pointers. Only a handful of people read the manuscript, literally just 4 or 5, of whom 2 are here today, Sugata and my son Kanishk, who's sitting discreetly in the wings and who has appeared earlier today and will appear again before you in the course of the festival as a writer. But I didn't want to implicate too many people, particularly too many professional historians, precisely because I liked my biases and was determined to stick to them. So before the gentleman in the audience who spoke to Ram Guha at the end raises the issue of bias, I believe all history has to be based on verifiable, documented facts. But which facts you choose to emphasize are entirely up to you. And I have made my selection, and they are perhaps tendentious, but they point to a coherent argument that is extensively endnoted in the book. And to come to Sugata's question, I was thinking, here we are, the irony of sitting in front of this magnificent monument, this very beautiful building, which is also at the same time evidence of the monstrous exploitation of this country by the people who built that in the name of a particular queen, in whose name, of course, for almost 70 years, they despoiled this country. And I must say, I have had a very strong view that we should convert the Victoria Memorial into the world's premier museum of displaying the loot and exploitation of British colonialism in India. I know the curator of this museum, Joyanto, is probably horrified. He's standing somewhere in the audience. Oh, he's right here. And he has done a beautiful job within the mandate he has now been given. But, all these decorous paintings by the Daniels and so on are all very well. There are plenty of places we should probably do a fair swap with the Victoria and Albert and say, you take the British artists, give us back the things you stole from us, and how about the Kohinoor while you're about it? So,
and also Tipu Sultan's wealth from his palace.
And his wonderful tiger.
And wonderful tiger, yes.
Tipu Sultan manufactured a mechanical tiger mauling a British soldier, which can be seen, ironically, in London.
In the Nehru Gallery of the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Of the Victoria and Albert Museum. So we could negotiate a serious swap, I think, of bringing Indian artifacts here that the British stole and giving them perhaps a few things like the paintings of the wonderful Daniels, but at the same time, here in this country, I think our own willingness to brush British atrocities under the carpet needs to be questioned. But let me come back to Sugata's question. It's curious. He's absolutely right, of course, as he often is, that in many ways things got worse rather than getting better. When you look at the late 18th century, though I would not in any way excuse Clive and Hastings for their loot, because they really robbed people blind and took vast sums of money back with them. In fact, for a century, throughout the 18th century, the British made fortunes in India. In fact, it was openly acknowledged to be the one place in the world where a mediocre Briton of modest accomplishment could make a fortune. It was India. Come here for a few years, you could steal, rob people blind, and leave with vast sums of money and, of course, untold jewels. The Pitt diamond, which is probably purloined from a temple in Tamil Nadu by the then governor of Madras, Thomas Pitt, went on to found the political dynasty in England that produced 2 prime ministers. Both the Pitts are actually descended, as it were, from the Pitt diamond's wealth. So when you think in terms of how much was robbed and stolen, I'm not as prepared as Sugata is to indulge in them as minor peccadillos, because they really did make off with a phenomenal amount of wealth from here. But he's right that, for example, some of the racism was actually worse in the following century. Partly this was because in the 18th century, by and large, the British men who came over here took Indian wives. It was difficult to preserve racial exclusivity when Lord Ochterlony, for example, or Sir David Ochterlony, I guess he was at that time, had to write to the Governor-General for permission for Lady Ochterlony to go on the Hajj, because Lady Ochterlony was an Indian Muslim woman. So, that was how things were in the 18th century. But by the 1820s or so, the fishing fleet came into being. That is the shiploads of English spinsters making their way to India to nab young Englishmen. And once they came, I think notions of racial exclusivity, superiority, and separation got intensified. And of course, worsened throughout the 19th century. The second aspect, and it's interesting that Sugata mentions Curzon and Churchill, who of course in Britain are by and large seen as heroes, Churchill especially. They came, as it were, to their peak at a time when there was a greater pretense of good intentions than the original English presence in India ever conveyed. So throughout the 18th and early 19th century, no one was in any doubt the British were here for the money. It was, indecorous but blunt and direct. They were here to exploit as much as they could and do as well as they could. After the Queen's proclamation of 1858 and the Crown rule, there had to be this pretense. And the advent of hypocrisy can really be dated to that period onwards, when the British pretended they were here to rule for the benefit of the Indians, while privately admitting to themselves that that was the farthest thing from their actual intentions. So, you have Victoria proclaiming that Indians will be associated with the administration of the country, and Lord Lytton writing to Queen Victoria, but of course we don't really mean this, do we? Because, we've taken this token number of Indians into the ICS, and we've treated them abominably and given them no real power or authority, because, of course, we can't. This is our rule. I mean, that was essentially what was being said in private communications and behind closed doors. And so there was all this talk of the civilizing mission, but the moment Indians took it literally, and as I've written in the book, for example, it's often not known that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's son, Justice Syed Mahmood, actually went to Oxford, got a law degree, came back, and became the first Indian judge in the Allahabad High Court. But the British were so horrified at the very notion of an Indian dispensing British justice that they essentially humiliated him in both small and major ways, finally driving him to drink and pushing him off the court. And he died a sort of tragic and bewailed death in his 50s. Because, again, this hypocrisy meant that the pretense was never sincere. As late as the 1920s, there is a British Home Secretary I've quoted in the book, who said quite simply that all this talk of ruling India for the good of the Indians is simple cant, and we know it. We seized India by the sword and we held it with by the yardstick, I think he said, and we shall continue to do so. Or words to that effect. The actual quote is even more pungent, and it's in the book. So Churchill's conduct against that background was reprehensible, but of a piece with this entire approach. So if you look at the Bengal famine, which was caused, as you know, deliberately by the decisions of the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to export grain from starving, famine-affected, drought-affected Bengal to Europe, not even to actually feed people, but to buffer the reserve stocks for a future potential invasion of Greece. The actions of the man were nothing short of criminal. He should have been dragged before the International Criminal Tribunal at The Hague for war crimes. This man, not only did he decide to export grain, but when reports came of people dying, he actually said, the deaths of anyway underfed Bengalis matters much less than that of sturdy Tommies. That's literally Churchill's words, quote unquote. When Australian ships laden with grain were calling on Calcutta port, Churchill ordered that they should not be allowed to disembark their grain, but had to sail on to Europe. And when conscience-stricken British officials in Calcutta sent dispatches back to London about the horrors that were being inflicted, I mean, literally 4 million people died, some just dying on the streets because of Churchill's decisions. All Churchill could do was to write peevishly in the margin, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man that the British have the gall to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy. If you look at the 35 million Indians who died totally unnecessary deaths in famines throughout the British Raj, and I say totally unnecessary because they died because of British policy. And it was very deliberate, conscious, articulated policy that, number one, you shall not interfere with the free market. If people can't afford to buy food, too bad. Number two, Malthusian principles must prevail. If the land can't sustain the population, then let the population die until the right balance is asserted. And number three, the Victorian principle, fiscal prudence. Do not spend money you haven't budgeted for. So no charity, no famine relief was policy on these grounds. And it wasn't, by the way, just against us. They did the same thing to the Irish, which is why so many hundreds of thousands died in Ireland in the 1840s potato blight, and so many migrated to America to flee the iniquities of British rule. But anyway, the British, we didn't have that option too much in India, so we suffered under the British. And 35 million people died. Now you compare that to the great genocides of modern history that we all read about. You compare to Stalin killing perhaps 20 million, Mao killing perhaps 10, 11 million. I mean, the British come across as far worse than the great genocidal killers that we are all, brought up to hold in contempt and revulsion. it's quite astonishing that we don't really see how awful this was on its own terms.
Yeah, these were quiet holocausts, which haven't really been written about in the way that you have in this book.
One book about
Yes.
Davies' late Victorian Holocaust, which
Yes.
on famines is pretty
Yes,
scathing.
in fact, I wanted to go back to that because, of course, the late 18th century was a period of economic loot and plunder. But all that I was suggesting was that you don't have that kind of nationalistic imperialism imbued with a sense of racial superiority.
Which Kipling and so on articulated, exactly.
Yeah, well,
Horrible.
that started with the Wellesley generation.
Right.
During the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, even the British nation was forged in opposition to the French other, to the Catholic other, and the colonial other, not least in India. But despite the economic loot and plunder, India continued to be quite rich until the 1810s. The historians have pinpointed the decade of the 1810s, exactly 200 years ago, as the beginning of the great divergence in the economic fortunes of Europe and Asia.
Right.
Europe and China and India.
But Angus Madison says that 1820, China and India together were 50% of global GDP, 27 China, 23
Yes,
India.
but from that point onwards, there is this
Complete
great
decline.
divergence.
Yeah.
And you're right, of course, about the Bengal famine. There was no aggregate food availability decline, and yet, close to 4 million people died. But since we are here in the Victoria Memorial, I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the story of the 19th century. Queen Victoria was proclaimed the Queen of India in 1858.
Right.
She was proclaimed Kaisar-e-Hind, Empress of India, in 1877. And in 1897, the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria's reign was celebrated with great pomp and ceremony. And 1897 was probably one of the worst years of famine in India. And the British medical journal Lancet estimated that in the 1890s alone, 19 million Indians died because of famines. And just to place it in context, that was about half of the population of Great Britain at that time. And even though it happened just before Curzon became viceroy, the famines continued into the early 20th century. And what you see among British commentators led by Curzon is to try and portray the crimes of man as acts of God. Curzon would, write in the language that we now hear from the proponents of Hindutva about Muslim population growth. He writes about Indian population growth in those terms and tries to pass off what were problems of political economy as problems of nature. So, what's the story of the 19th century? That you have arguments about India failing to industrialize deliberately as a result of British policy, and perhaps you could expound on that before I come to the politics of the
Sure.
late 19th and the 20th century.
Sure. I mean, everything Sugata said, of course, I subscribe to, so I won't repeat them. But if you look at the fact that at the beginning of the 19th century, India was still a major industrial power in the world. We were the world's leading textile power. That is, we were the biggest manufacturers of high-quality textiles, as well as the biggest exporters of textiles to a variety of markets, east and west. One of the striking things, by the way, was that there are documented, not merely anecdotal instances in the 17th and 18th centuries of British shopkeepers trying to pass off shoddy European-made goods as made in India, because made in India had the reputation for having the highest quality of textiles, in particular linens, muslins, and so on. In fact, the gauzes of Dhaka, light as woven air, I mean, these were all the stuff of legend around the world. And India, of course, exported all of this. So what did the British government do? They came systematically, destroyed this. They broke the looms. They depopulated places like Murshidabad and Dhaka. Literally, Dhaka became 1/3 its population within 20 years, the beginning of the 19th century. And in at least one episode, I say this very cautiously because British historians claim this is completely made-up Indian propaganda, but one document I have read is an account by a contemporary Dutch observer in 1772. They cut off the thumbs of weavers, so the weavers couldn't weave again. This was the policy, followed by the fact that since they controlled the ports, they imposed extremely severe penalties, duties and tariffs on Indian exports from India, while removing them on British imports into India. So that was the way in which the textile industry was destroyed. You probably don't know that we had the world's leading shipbuilding industry, and that India's ships were considered the finest ships in the world. The craftsmanship was considered world-class. In fact, because of the quality of the wood used, mahogany and teak, our ships lasted 23, 24 years on average, whereas the typical European ship, made essentially of fir or pine, basically lasted 6 or 7 years. And of course, the brass work, everything else that went on the ship, we were top class. When the British conquered Bengal and northeastern India, they in fact made it a point to start manufacturing ships in India. But that resulted in the early 19th century in shipyard, dockyard workers and shipwrights and so on being thrown out of work in London. So in 1810, I think it was, the British Parliament passed an act that essentially made it impossible for ships made in India to ply the lucrative London routes. And as a result, eventually the shipbuilding industry in India died out. Third example, which many of us perhaps don't even know, but since we're sponsored by Tata Steel, it's worth telling, is that we had the world's leading steel industry. Our steel was invented in Karnataka, and the name for it was Ukku steel. Ukka was a Kannadiga word, which when the British, before the British, other European travelers transmuted it, it became transcribed as Wootz steel, W-O-T-Z, which made it sound vaguely Polish or German. It was actually a Kannada word. It was Indian steel. Indian technology is what the Arabs came and learned from and took back to make the famous Damascus steel. And Indian steel was so famous that our swords were considered the best in the world, to the point when British soldiers invading India in the early years, in the 18th century, for example, they would shoot Indian soldiers and dismount and steal their swords, because their swords are made of so much better steel than anything the Europeans had. Now, this is another industry the British systematically destroyed. And, of course, later they imposed their own steel industry. I've told the story, by the way, of the entire, it's too long to recount here, but of the entire history of how the British built up their steel industry at our expense, how they then imposed, when Jamshedji Tata, since this is a Tata Steel-sponsored conference, let me pay him tribute, struggled for decades to try and get India to set up a modern steel plant to compete with the British, the various hurdles that were placed in his path. And then finally, when he got permission, he died, in fact, before the first steel could be produced. His son presided over the first steel production from Jamshedpur. But when Tata was to do this, the then chairman of the railway board, a senior imperial official, sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel an Indian was capable of producing. I only wish he'd lived long enough to see the descendants of Jamshedji Tata acquire the remnants of British steel and taking over Chorus in the 1990s. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. But anyway, so that's on the industrial front. Now, the argument made on the other side is, oh, well, they say, the British say, it wasn't, we didn't do this to you. You simply missed the bus for industrialization. To which my answer is, if we missed the bus because you threw us under its wheels. And here are the three examples of industries in which you systematically destroyed Indian industry. Now, going beyond the throwing under the wheels of industrialization is the denial to India of the possibilities of catching up. Let's face it, when we had the most prosperous textile exporters and textile manufacturers, why wouldn't they, as modern industry came online elsewhere, have also imported the same sorts of machines and made them here? They couldn't, simply because the British denied it to them. The British wanted to send goods made in Manchester and elsewhere and the satanic steam mills of Lancashire to the Indian market. And essentially that's why the deindustrialization of India financed the industrialization of Britain, and at the same time, the same industrialization was denied to India through much of the 19th century. We haven't got to, and we won't get to the politics until Sugata asked this question, but on the economic front, this was the narrative throughout the century. It was accompanied by various things that really had their origins in the end of the previous century, land settlement schemes, which were based on a number of British approaches that were foreign to our soil. There was, first of all, there was this entire ruling by the rule book, which I've talked about at various stages, including Victorian Britain. But whereas in India, tax collection had existed, I'm sure at various times in various places had been unfair too, but there was always a culture of understanding. History shows that in times of drought and famine, taxes were usually waived. If somebody had a wedding in the family or a death in the family, taxes weren't collected at that time. There was this whole human interaction involved. With the British, everything was flattened by the book. The rates they charged were higher than ever charged before. The lowest tax rate the British ever charged was 45%. The averages between 85 and 90% of the crop had to be taken by the East India Company. People who couldn't pay, even for legitimate reasons like these reasons I mentioned to you, were taken out in public and stripped and flogged and tortured and so on. There were horrendous stories. There's recorded instances of peasants fleeing lands ruled by the East India Company in order to take refuge in Indian princely states where they'd be treated more humanely. So agricultural landlessness and poverty, and landlessness made worse, of course, by the settlements that created zamindars out of revenue collectors that essentially made the tiller of the soil into a tenant rather than the hereditary tiller of the land in many parts of the country. Now, I know it's much more complicated than this, and in fact, with Sugata's help, I've briefly talked a little bit about the various systems, very little. The point is that as a general proposition, the land settlement schemes of the British helped create landlessness and poverty, which have gone on to this day. Final non-political example, I think everything is political in the end, was the way in which the British consciously adopted divide and rule after 1858. And maybe Sugata wants to talk about that separately, so I won't elaborate. But the way in which the map, the museum, and the census all became instruments of colonial domination and control, and particularly of divisions that we have since absorbed ourselves and made part of our self-identification, is another one of the sad legacies of colonial rule. A lot of Indian casteism, a lot of Indian communal and other divides are a direct result of the removal of the fuzziness of self-identification that had demonstrably prevailed until the British put an end to it in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, I can elaborate on that whenever you want.
Yeah, as you can see, I mean, what the book shows very clearly is that there was nothing ancient about India's poverty. And when Indian textiles couldn't be sold in world markets from about the 1810s onwards, China tea became the most profitable item in the East India Company's trade, but paid for, of course, by Indian opium. That was another aspect of the economic exploitation of Asia, both India and China. But let me pick up on the political points and perhaps ask two interrelated questions. In the last session, towards the end, Ram Guha cited Claude Auchinleck. And of course, the British have often claimed that they unified India, passing off some kind of administrative unification of the British Indian provinces with unity in a much deeper sense, which had lasted for much longer in the subcontinent's history. But also, if you could talk about what you've alluded to, divide and rule, I would put it slightly differently. I mean, you quote Elphinstone, for example, in your book, who makes a rather bold statement of how the religious communities in India need to be divided. And of course, at the time of the partition of Bengal, similar statements were made. But I would want to suggest that what happened after 1858 was that the British decided to privilege the religious distinction as the basis of social enumeration. So political majorities and minorities got predefined along religious lines. That's the first time that we began to think of Hindus forming a majority at the All India level, Muslims being the largest or the most significant minority. So is it just a question of pitting communities against one another, or, as you were beginning to suggest, a scheme of classification which has left a lasting legacy on which communal politics is built in India even today?
Even today. But the fact is that I think it was both, and I'll explain why. Elphinstone's memo that Sugata refers to is a memo in which he says, divide et impera was an ancient Roman maxim and it shall be ours. Divide et impera, divide and rule. Now, why did he write that? Because the British were horrified by the so-called mutiny. The revolt of 1857 showed Hindu and Muslim soldiers side by side fighting under the banner of the enfeebled and largely symbolic Mughal emperor to overthrow the hated Firangi. And this was the one thing the British could not imagine, because these are soldiers whose living was being paid for, as it were, by carrying arms for the British, and here they were turning those arms against the British. So they felt that the only way they could preserve this was by division. It was a very conscious political project. And as Sugata mentioned, coming to this wonderful state, in Bengal in 1905, there was a conscious decision made to partition Bengal in order to create a Muslim majority province, precisely to further the politics of division. And this was accentuated not only in terms of internal memos, but by some of the public statements. Bamphil Fuller, the governor, lieutenant governor, as it were, at that time, specifically talked about how he has two wives, Mohammedan and Hindu, and he prefers the Mohammedan wife, and so on. All of this was very, very overt signaling. It wasn't even particularly quiet. But what was interesting was that when this project was first announced, the Nawab of Dhaka, who was a Muslim nobleman, said, "This is a beastly idea, I shall never stand for it." Whereupon the British quietly slipped him £100,000 and he changed his tune. This is how the British fomented the process of division. Secondly, and of course the founding of the Muslim League 1 year later, 1906, was actually paid for in part by the British, who specifically asked. And the irony was that the Indian National Congress had actually been, if they were at all sincere in their professions of wanting to create responsible self-governance, the Indian National Congress in those first 21 years of its existence had been such a model party of colonial sort of non-agitational demands for rights for Indians, that it should have been the perfect nucleus to raise, as it were, a loyal opposition out of. But the British were never sincere in their professions of actually promoting responsible self-governance. They found it more useful to divide this incipient national movement than to actually embrace it and co-opt it into the governing process. It's very striking. So rather than welcome this very, very responsible group, I've read a fascinating book by a British journalist published in 1907, Henry Nevinson, who came here and traveled through India, not just Bengal, the Madras Presidency, Bombay, etc., and has written a wonderfully detailed account, very much in a journey. I think it was the Sunday Times, I can't remember now. Very detailed account, substantial book, with plenty of details in it of all of these things, including, for example, he attends a public meeting conducted by the Indian National Congress on Marina Beach in Chennai, and he recounts the resolution passed. All this is 1905, 1906, etc. And he can't believe that these people are being treated as subversives and a threat to the empire and so on by the British, who are meanwhile paying to create the Muslim League. But anyway, that's one part of the narrative. But I would also insist that the sectarian divisions, caste and creed, that the British promoted were also part of their deliberate policies. It may not have all been politically motivated, because sometimes it actually was politically counterproductive for them, but it was part of their approach. Because as with the museums, the purpose of classifying people was to control them better. When you categorize somebody, you understand them more, you control them, you put them in a little box, the way you put these exhibits in museums. That's what the census did. It's striking, for example, that right up to Wajid Ali Shah of Shatranj Ke Khiladi fame, the Muharram festival in Lucknow had been celebrated, or commemorated, wrong word, commemorated by Shias, Sunnis and Hindus jointly without any incident in recorded history of any trouble. The British come and say nothing doing. Muharram is a Shia festival, the Shias will be in charge of it. Within a couple of years, the Sunnis are carping at the Shias are insulting the Sunnis back, trouble starts, riots start. The Shia-Sunni divisions in Lucknow can be traced directly to British policy. And by the way, a lot of the documentation of this has been done by an American scholar, Keith Hawkshaw, not by some biased Indian, as you like. Similarly, caste. It was the whole British notion of the ethnographic census, which began in 1872. This entire thing of actually working out, so they created the whole idea of criminal tribes. Somehow the entire tribe, anyone born into it, had to be a criminal. Or the martial races, where somebody was automatically fit. So the poor Bengalis were too effeminate to be martial races, but the sturdy Pathans could be. I mean, one of the reasons that Pakistan now has this ridiculously over-financed and disproportionately large army is because the British started it by decreeing the Punjabi Muslim and the Pathan to be martial races. So that's when they got disproportionate representation in the British Indian Army. And caste. Again, many scholars with lots of evidence have demonstrated that caste was not particularly set in stone in terms of practice. The British, in their effort to understand India the better to rule it, proceeded to actually remove the fuzziness out of caste distinctions and force people into straitjackets. The truth is that even if there are textual things like the Manusmriti and so on, people didn't live according to the Manusmriti in practice. There are lots of documents that exist, but no Christian today is living strictly according to the tenets of the Bible, and certainly the same was true of Hindus throughout history. But the British decreed that the Chaturvarna system was the way it was supposed to be. The Brahmins brought in by Warren Hastings to write the Code of Gentoo Laws here in Calcutta in the 1790s promptly wrote themselves at the top of the heap, even though there's real doubt as to whether they ever enjoyed the kind of authority they persuaded the British they always had. In fact, William Jones, whom Sugata mentioned earlier, founded the Asiatic Society here, William Jones was the one person who was skeptical. He said, these Brahmins are inventing Hindu tradition as it suits them, and if they can't find it in the scriptures, they will invent it for you for ready money. But Jones died young, and his skepticism was, his understanding also, a brilliant man, was not shared by others. And as a result, of course, the British decided that what they knew of Hinduism was this, and Hindus began to learn Hinduism from the British. We began to tell ourselves that this is how things are supposed to be. So in many ways, the caste system, as the British defined it, overlooked historical experience of mobility amongst castes. The fact that, for example, if you take a subcaste like the Kayasths, they started off as Shudras, but because they learned Persian and became scribes to the court, they rose up the social ladder to be extremely prominent, influential, and powerful people, carrying on right into the ICS days, by the way, in the 20th century. But that would not fit into the British theories. The whole M.N. Srinivas thesis of Sanskritization is left out in the way in which the British defined the caste system. So a lot of the self-definition, backward classes of castes on various kinds of disabilities, was also a legacy of the British. Now, I want to quickly add a footnote before giving it back to Sugata, which is some Dalit friends have pointed out that many Dalits believe that it was British rule that freed them from years of upper caste Hindu oppression, and therefore why was that such a bad thing? To which my answer was, why do we assume that without the British we were incapable of reforming ourselves? Modern reform happened various ways. Yes, Jyotiba Phule, Mahatma Phule, and Dr. Ambedkar were both products of, if you like, the British Raj and British education systems. But in my own home state of Kerala, in Travancore, Mahatma Ayyankali, in a princely state, led a movement for Dalit rights in the 1850s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, before either Phule or Ambedkar, and didn't have the benefit of a British education. Indians are capable. Just as I believe that the credit for abolishing sati should go to Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Bentinck happened to be the ruler who signed it into law because they were the guys who wrote the laws. But the movement had to come from an Indian. Widow remarriage was made possible by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He is the one who set the example, married a widow and said this cannot be wrong. Indians, including Hindus, very much so, were capable of reforming themselves, and I believe reform would have come. One final thing, Sugata, your very first question I didn't answer. National unity, political unity. I would argue that the notion of Indian unity has existed since time immemorial. The idea of Bharatvarsh in the Rig Veda, from the Himalayas to the oceans, right there. Adi Shankara from Kerala, traveling in the 7th century all the way to Kashmir and establishing his mutt, to Dwarka in the west, to Puri in the east. The entire sort of, people in the south wanting to die in Kashi, etc. Where does all this come from? It's this unity of the so-called sacred geography. The phrase of Diana Eck, the Harvard scholar whom Sugata knows, the sacred geography of India knit together by tracks of pilgrimage. But that may be a particularly Hindu idea, but the Muslims also shared it culturally. Maulana Azad has written of how Indian Muslims going on the Hajj were seen by Muslims from other parts of the world, and particularly by the Arabs, as being from Hind. Whether they were Pathans or Tamils, they were seen as being from a definable, recognizable civilizational space. And so that notion of one country predated the British by far. and would have continued. Nehru has written about this far more eloquently and beautifully than any of us can. And he's talked about this idea of India, which has got this entire shared history, shared geography, shared culture, shared civilization, heritage, which certainly was not a gift of the British. In fact, the biggest punishment of the British was the fact that their divide and rule led to the partition that has actually eviscerated a land that was essentially seen as one for 3,000 years. After all, from the days of the Mauryas trying to conquer all of it, to Akbar and Aurangzeb trying to conquer all of it, there was always this sense of one common space that various rulers had felt the need to try and unite under their power. The main thing that kept them from doing so was the primitive state of old-fashioned, of old days, communications and transport. With modern 19th century, 20th century transport and links, some ruler would have certainly knit all of India together without the pain of partition as well.
Yeah, I agree, of course, that the idea of Bharatbarsha, the idea of Hind or Hindustan, pre-existed British colonial rule in India. But I think what I would add is that the establishment of the British Empire led many Indians also to privilege the eras of imperial unity, the Mauryas and the Guptas and the Mughals and so on. But what I would like to stress today is that the periods of political decentralization in India were not necessarily periods of economic decline or cultural decay.
Absolutely.
Just think of the period between the Mauryas and the Guptas. That was the period when the close links were forged with Southeast Asia. Or the period 1,000 years ago when the Cholas were sailing to across the Bay of Bengal. I want to raise a couple of dangers of the kind of unrelenting critique and indictment that you have of British rule, with much of which I agree. But I feel that there is a risk that we will stop being self-critical if we go too far in that direction. And let me say why. I'll give two examples. I'll put the first question to you now. Of course, Gandhi had famously said that the Hindu-Muslim problem or divide was coeval with the British advent in India. He was not far wrong. But I feel that in your book, you put practically all of the blame on the British and the Muslim League, which of course the British helped create in 1906 and then encouraged in 1940 to pass the Lahore Resolution. Yet, just consider that within the Indian National Congress, the party to which you now belong, there were those who believed in a kind of Hindu majoritarianism in UP, a kind of Hindu minoritarianism in Punjab, and that, I think, upset the Muslim minority, leading them to put forward a claim that they were not just a minority, but a nation. In fact, Ram Guha, in the question and answer session after his Netaji oration on the 23rd of January, went to the extent of saying that there were probably only three major leaders of the Indian National Congress in the early 20th century, Gandhi, Nehru, and Bose, who genuinely believed in Hindu-Muslim unity and some kind of a variant of secularism, that there were other leaders, including Patel in Gujarat or Malviya in UP, who did not. So don't you think we need to be self-critical as well in promoting a kind of politics which may have contributed to the tragic partition of India? Can we put all of the blame on the British and their support for the Muslim League?
No, I think it's fair to say that we obviously had our share of culpability, both at this level, though I think if Ram said that, he's exaggerating a bit, because I can certainly name Maulana Azad and Rafi Ahmed Kidwai and Rajgopalachari and
of course the Ali brothers. But,
yeah,
but that's precisely what I'm saying. Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali were Gandhi's closest compatriots in the early 1920s. Now, Muhammad Ali was president of the Indian National Congress in 1923.
And of the Muslim League.
He talked, and of the Muslim League, and he talked about a federation of faiths. Now, what he said in the early 1920s as Congress president was entirely acceptable. But when he left the Congress and said more or less the same thing in the early 1930s, the Congress's nationalism had become so singular by that time that he was being branded communal. So that is the kind of problem that I'm trying to identify.
No, but you know, if you look, for example, also at the grassroots, at the sort of tactical level, what were the British doing in 1940? It wasn't just encouraging the League to pass the partition resolution. It was also because the Congress, I think, with hindsight, rather foolishly resigned the ministries that they had won in the elections of 37. The British appointed Muslim leaguers to positions they had not earned by election and gave them the opportunity to gain in strength through the actual dispensation of patronage and the accumulation of privilege and the exercise of privilege, I beg your pardon, by wielding power that they should not otherwise have had. And the British, in their private notes, were absolutely clear as to what they were doing. This is a party that cannot survive without us affording this help. But the help went very far because with all this patronage and pelf, the League grew fat to the point where a party of just a few lakh members in 1939, which had been humiliated in the Muslim seats in the 1937 election. The Congress Party had won more Muslim seats than the Muslim League had. By the end of the Second World War, the Muslim League had become a party of 2 crore members and had become the most credible force. Of course, all the Congress leaders and main workers were in jail as after the Quit India movement. So there was nobody there. So not only did the Congress emerge from jail in 1945, having been completely sort of overtaken, as it were, in the last few miles by the British patronage given to the League, but they had actually become unaware of the extent to which they had left the field of battle to the other side. Now, you might say that that is not purely a British ploy, that after all, British didn't tell the congressman to go to jail, but the fact is the congressman did, and therefore, in this particular instance, the Muslim League was able to benefit from British patronage to be in a position to win the elections of 46 and push their claims to partition. As to Hindu majoritarianism, I suspect that you're right, there were definitely some Hindu majoritarians, but I've often seen that sometimes the fundamentalists of both faiths actually get along far better with each other because they seem to recognize the ground rules, as it were, that separate them and that unite them. And as long as the framework was of one country, they would not perhaps have interdined and let alone intermarried or any such thing, but they would have maintained civil relations with each other. It was the fact that the British were creating a climate of encouraging separation and division to further their own rule that I think made it possible and made perhaps separation inevitable. Some of the worst examples of virulent sort of anti-Indianism or separatism came from people who were not particularly fundamentalist. Jinnah himself, as you know, had lived a life that was far more secular than Islamist. Many people didn't fully understand what partition would involve. That's the other thing. One of the funniest stories, I don't remember if I've told it in the book, I probably have not, is that the first High Commissioner designate of Pakistan to India wanted to keep his Indian passport while being appointed Pakistan's High Commissioner because he owned a lot of property around Lucknow that he didn't want to have to surrender by becoming a foreigner. So he said, why can't I be a citizen of both countries? And he had to be told, sorry, this is not possible. And he had to, in the end, give up either the Indian passport or the High Commissionership. I've forgotten which he gave up. But he was the first named High Commissioner designate of Pakistan to India. Jinnah certainly thought that he could cheerfully maintain his residence in Bombay and visit it from time to time. He even planned to retire in Bombay.
In fact, Jinnah wanted to convene the Pakistan Constituent Assembly in Delhi. And only in July of 1947, only when that was refused did he convene it in Karachi on the 11th of August and made his, now famous speech. Now, I think I'm getting signals from the organizers that I should quickly now go to the audience. I'll simply add that exactly at the time that the British were encouraging the politics of separation during the Second World War, that they were being particularly unkind to Mahatma Gandhi. And it's when he went on a fast in February of 1943 that Churchill was saying that this is no time to crawl before a miserable old man. Linlithgow was saying that if he dies, there'll be 6 months' trouble and then nothing after that, and so on. And this was a a period when, of course, Subhash Chandra Bose was coming by submarine exactly in that period to lead the struggle for freedom. The other point that I wanted to make, which I'll just briefly mention, where we need to be self-critical, is that your book contains a catalogue of really terrible laws that were enacted by the British in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But 70 years after independence, I think that we ought to take some responsibility for having kept them on the statute books. I know that you've made a personal attempt to get Section 377 removed. I feel that we really ought to join forces to see whether we can get the law of sedition.
I've also put a private member's bill on that. Please join me on that.
The law of sedition, which was used to persecute our freedom fighters, are still on our statute books and are now being deployed against innocent students who face trumped-up charges and so forth. But having said that, let me...
377 got all the attention because the BJP shouted it down and made it the first bill in the history of independent India not to be introduced at all because it was voted down at the introduction stage. Whereas my sedition bill has been introduced and, of course, will be quietly shelved if they can possibly help it. But it has been successfully introduced.
Yeah, of course, and I called for the repeal of the sedition law when I spoke in the debate on the current situation in the universities last February, about a year ago.
Right.
So let's have questions from the audience.
Wow, lots
and lots of hands have gone up. Let's go to the lady there first.
Is there a mic coming around?
There's a microphone coming around for you.
I have the mic.
I'll go to you next. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. I would like you to tell us whether Indians are actually losing their right to complain about their colonial history now that they're pursuing such neo-imperial ambitions all over South Asia.
Are we pursuing neo-imperial ambitions around South Asia?
I don't think we can deny that we
No,
are.
give me a couple of examples. No, genuinely, I'm not denying it. I'm honestly a bit surprised by the question. Where are we being neo-imperial elsewhere in South Asia?
So we have...
Within the boundaries of constitutional India, yes, but outside?
So we have identified ourselves as a big brother in the South Asian region, be it with Nepal, be it with Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. We have tried to be very patronizing in our approach, but I think that is working towards a new imperial trend.
I think you're being a little unfair, my dear. The fact is that all big countries have this problem. India, if you look at the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, put them all around a table. India accounts for 70% of the population and 80% of the GDP. Inevitably, it displaces more weight. You know, you ask any of the neighbors of the United States what they think of their big brother. It's just inevitable. In fact, the wonderful Mexican statesman Porfirio Diaz memorably bemoaned the fate of his own country, saying, "Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." You know, I mean, I'm sure that there are equivalent Maldivian and Sri Lankan and Bangladeshi feelings and Nepalese feelings about India. To some degree, we have to overcompensate with what I call asymmetrical relations to these countries, where we give more than we expect in return, simply in order to overcompensate for the size. And that's what we've been doing. Sugata was a great ally on the committee when we passed the constitutional amendment bill that settled the border with Bangladesh, where we actually gave more than we got, but we felt it was important to end this long-running sore in our relations with the smaller neighbor. So I would say that we're not neo-imperial at all. We suffer from a problem that many big countries suffer with their smaller neighbors, but you should not confuse that with a conscious design of trying to bully or push others around. I've been to all these countries. In some places, say Bhutan, for example, for the longest time we were the only embassy on the spot, so we kind of loom larger than life. In Bangladesh, we are one of several. Yes, probably the Indian High Commissioner has more expertise on the intricacies of what's going on in Bangladesh than, say, the American would. But the fact is that's because we are a neighbor and we have so much in common with them. But it doesn't mean that we are using this to try and push or thrust any neo-imperial control. I'm not honestly sure we're capable of it. And if we were to try, I think we'd come a cropper. Therefore, we shouldn't try.
It's hard to deny those who have ownership of the roving microphones, but I would like to give a couple of people a chance who are the backbenchers there, who have been listening very carefully. But
I will give my mic.
Okay, thank you.
Very generous. But they should come back to you later because of your fairness.
There are a number of hands of... I see young faces in the back, and so I'd like to give them an opportunity. Yeah.
Good evening. So, if you're talking about darkness, so we've reached now to this era where there's neo-colonialism. So, what would your views be on that?
You'll have to define what you mean by that. I'm sorry to say that I'm very wary of a lot of jargonistic ideological terms which have the content, I'm afraid, of other jargonistic ideological terms. Tell me what you mean by neocolonialism. If you mean there are some big countries trying to push their weight around other countries, in some cases that's true, in some cases it's not true. A blanket theory may or may not apply.
Perhaps you can say something about what you have in your book. You have a critique of Neil Ferguson,
Yeah.
who, of course, wants to champion an idea of American empire, which would somehow sort of not quite resemble,
Okay,
but
so-
seek inspiration from the British
Thank you,
empire.
Sugata, to the rescue, because yes, I do. Neil Ferguson, the Scottish historian, actually wrote a pair of books at the beginning of the century. One called Empire, in which he tried to justify the British Empire, calling it a jolly good thing, the capital G, capital T. And then a book called Colossus, in which he spoke of America as being uniquely suited to replicate the great achievements of the British Empire in the Middle East. That was published in the beginning of 2003, just as America was poised to invade Baghdad. So obviously, I'm sure he recants a little bit, at least the second one. But the argument that that people like Neil Ferguson, Andrew Roberts, Lawrence James, many of whom I've cited in my book, have made is the British Empire laid the foundations for the globalization that has made lots of countries prosper in the 21st century, that they introduced the killer apps of modern civilization and beneficently gave them to the rest of the globe. Lawrence James actually said the British Empire was the greatest act of benign altruism in human history, which made me choke. But the fact is that this kind of thesis is being advanced. And yes, I have refuted it in some detail in the book. As Sugata said early on, it's really not a narrative history. It's a thematic argument. The book is an argument. It's an argument first about all the things the British did wrong. Then it takes the various arguments made in defense of the empire, such as the railways, rule of law, political unity, etc., and demolishes them one by one. And then the last sort of quarter of the book, it takes up some of these arguments, including about the contemporary period, the afterlife of colonialism, and talks about that as well. So it is a pretty broad-ranging indictment of British colonialism, specifically in India, but towards the end broadening to a wider global.
You know, once I was on a panel like this with Neil Ferguson, and he said that the period 1870 to 1914 was an era of peace in global history, that there was no war after the Franco-Prussian War, and until the outbreak of the Balkan War and then the First World War, completely forgetting, of course, that practically the whole of Southeast Asia, excepting Java, was conquered in that period.
And large chunks of Africa.
And partition of Africa. You know, Egypt 1882 set the ball rolling for the scramble over Africa among European powers. There are so many hands up that, yes, whoever has the microphone at this
And
stage.
I think the gentleman who
And this
sacrificed the
gentleman,
mic should be.
the one who sacrificed the microphone will get a chance after this young man has spoken.
Sir, I would like to know that how far the British has impacted our education system, both positively or negatively.
I do talk about that, and I explain that it's negative. And the British had no intention of imparting education to the Indian masses, far from it. In fact, they specifically decided they would not do that. But they decided they would create a small class of, if you like, interpreters, a buffer class between them and the masses they were going to govern. Macaulay's Minutes laid it out very clearly, a class of Indians, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste and in opinions and morals and in intellect, quote unquote. Now that class was always meant to be a small one. It was meant to be collaborating or cooperating with the Raj. And they could, if they wished, impart in Indian languages to Indians whatever wisdom they could gain from the British, but their job was basically to serve British interests in India. That was the entire logic of education. So as late as 1930, Will Durant, the American scholar, observed that the entire education budget of Britain and India, at all levels, right up to and including university level, did not equal the high school budget of the state of New York. So we were looking at this vast empire that had no desire to educate Indian people. And in 1947, they left us with a literacy rate below 17%, because the census of 1951 established 17%, so it was somewhere below that in 1947. Women had 8.5% literacy in India. Can you imagine, out of every 12.5 Indian women, only one could read and write? That was what Britain left us with. But where they did educate, it was very much to colonize the Indian mind. And so the idea was to create plaster Englishmen up to a point. I mean, at the simplest level, they had no desire to create Indians who could hold their own against the British. They were quite happy to create, if you like, the caricatured Bengali Babu of the 19th century, you know, described in Kipling's Kim and in so many other books. That's what they wanted. Somebody who'd never know English well enough to really challenge the English, but enough to serve the purposes of the English at petty levels of Indian administration. That sort of thing. And it is actually to the credit of the Indians that they seized this instrument, took it to their own advantage, learned it well enough to master the language and the ideas to which they had access to that language and turn it against the English. I mean, Dadabhai Naoroji was an Anglophile until he saw the horrors of the Odisha famine in 1866, whereupon he wrote Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, where he was reproaching the British for not being British enough in the way they were treating India. But this kind of thing was to the credit of the Indians, that instead of following the British project, they actually went way beyond anything the British ever intended. And it's very interesting. I mean, someone like Surendranath Banerjee was driven out of the ICS for a trivial infraction that would not even have earned an English ICS officer a reprimand. This British journalist I described, Henry Nevinson, 1907, heard a speech by Surendranath Banerjee and said he's the finest orator in English apart from Gladstone in the world. I mean, so there were Indians like that who were at a certain level that even the British held in awe, but that was never the intention. It's interesting, for example, that university education was entirely dominated by Indians because the English had no desire to create a class of university-educated Indians who could challenge their authority. So already in the early 20th century, pretty much all the I think the first Bengali Vice-Chancellor of Calcutta University would have been in the first decade of the 20th century or even the last decade of the 19th.
Yeah, Ashutosh Mukherjee took charge in 1906 and served up to 1920. Yeah.
So already Indians were coming in because this was the one field where we felt we could actually prepare Indians who could hold their own against the British. But the British education system has left us in many, many ways enfeebled. And Gauri Vishwanathan in Columbia wrote a wonderful book establishing that the study of English literature was invented by the British in India. There was no study of English literature before. The English used to study the Greek and Roman and Latin classics. But English literature was invented as a subject to overawe the Indians and so on, and to teach us to respect the British all the more. And what is more, to this day, we carry on a system where in all our schools we learn Shakespeare when we should. He's a wonderful writer, but we don't read Kalidasa, who, even given the small fragments of his work that have survived, perhaps 5% of his work has survived, is in every respect an equal to Shakespeare. Just read, even in English translation, Kalidasa's work. It's magnificent. And yet we know so little of that. How many Indian children have grown up thinking of Kalidasa on the same level as Shakespeare? We don't study the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in schools, whereas the British would have taught the Odyssey and the Iliad to their children. They taught us modern English literature because that's what they wanted us to respect. So we are still facing, I'm afraid, the lingering residue of that colonial heritage in education.
Okay, now the organizers have signaled that this has to be the last question.
Okay. Okay, Shashi, I have read your book. It's a fantastic book. But throughout the book,